Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Eternal Wanderings, the continuing journey of Kara O'Keefe by Danielle Ackley-McPhail, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. As Kara O'Keefe followed Sveta through the portal leaving Tirnanog, she staggered and nearly fell to her knees. At the heart of the Land of Youth, in Gobnu's court of Morhala, she had not grasped the scope of the change the naming had wrought in her. But, upon crossing into the mortal world, it became clear. In joining the pattern of her life to the Great Wall, she had also connected her soul to the race of the Tuatha De Danann. She had known this, but had not felt the impact earlier, deep as she had been in their magical realm. Beyond those bounds, she felt the links like silken threads trailing back to each and every one of her new kin. Not restricting, just connecting. To think months ago she'd been nothing more than a simple, if gifted, music teacher from Queens, New York, struggling to save the house she'd grown up in. About as far as one could get from joining the magical ranks of immortal elves. It was one thing to know she bore a Sid soul, their second most cherished one at that, but to feel the connection to her people, to know to her very core where they were, in rough direction and distance, if not precise location, the awe nearly overwhelmed her. She drew a sharp breath and resisted the impulse to examine those threads more closely in search of one in particular. Sveta looked back at Kara's gasp. Concern and confusion mingled in her gaze. "It's okay," Kara mumbled. "I just stumbled." "Thank you for waiting for me," she added. Sveta nodded but said nothing, clearly anxious to be away. Kara followed the young woman down the path leading to the Romani camp, fascinated by the long fall of her blue-black hair and the swish of her full skirt. As beautiful as it was with its bright colors and bold patterns, Kara couldn't imagine wearing such a thing in the day-to-day. But this wasn't New York or even Dublin. Things would be different among the Rome. Kara did not have the first clue just how different. A little nervous, she reached up and fingered the rune-engraved copper pendant hanging from its leather lanyard around her neck. She wore it in memory of Grand Dame Rose, a reminder of both her promise and Rose's sacrifice. The case containing Kara's violin, Quicksilver, lay comfortingly across her back, and the sprite, Beaksgath, had settled down to cuddle beneath the curtain of her hair. The rest of her scant things had already been taken to the caravan. It felt odd to leave her parents behind. In many ways she loathed to leave them or Tirnanog, but even if not for her vow to Grand Dame Rose, leaving was the prudent thing to do. Everyone needed time to come to terms with this reordering of their reality, herself included. Though born mostly human, Kara O'Keefe possessed a Sid soul, and not just any soul, but that of Anu, twin to the goddess Danu, from whom all other Sid had been reborn. It was difficult to come to grips with that, particularly when in the midst of the Tuatha De Danann, the children of Danu, not all of whom were pleased to welcome her as one of their own, despite evidence they could not refute. After the Battle of the Knock, where the demigods Ulcas and Dub attempted to besiege the gates of Tirnanog, Grand Dame Rose had offered Kara a place with the Calderis clan, an offer seconded by the rest of the clan on the night Kara had first played for them. Astounding, really, given the insular nature of the culture. Accepting that place now seemed the best way to distance herself as well as to fulfill the vow she had made. Rose's grandson, Tony de lo Costa, had been possessed by Ulcas. At the same time as Rose had offered Kara shelter with the Rom, she had also made her vow to free Tony. Physically, Kara already had when she defeated the demigods, but Tony's soul remained in torment at the memory of the atrocities committed using his body, including the murder of his grandmother by his own hand, if not his will. The Rom had already collected Rose's remains and her grandson. Kara had the sense that none of the clan were too happy about that, but the Rom took care of their own. That was one of the first things Rose had ever said to her. Family before all others. The Rom clearly weren't too comfortable about honoring their offer to Kara either, but hadn't denied her. She wouldn't have blamed them if they had, given the turmoil that seemed to follow her. First in New York, then again in Tir na Nog. She never invited it, but it came, just the same. As they approached the caravan, Kara was puzzled by the faint haze and scent of acrid smoke on the air. She reached out and gripped Sveta's shoulder. "What's going on? I thought we were leaving." The woman flinched, and her gaze shrouded further as she turned to look back, her eyes darting to view the far side of the clearing. Kara spied a fresh cairn just this side of the tree line, and beside it, Grand Dame Rose's traditional wagon, or vardo, engulfed in flame. One of the Sids stood beside it, containing the sparks and embers with a mage shield. Kara's brow dipped down, and her grip on Sveta's shoulder tightened. "What's going on here, and where is Tony?" "Din lo Gorgio, stupid outsider," Sveta muttered beneath her breath as she spat on the ground, her tone sharp and her expression offended. "That one is already tucked in his wagon, ready to leave, as we should be." She looked like she might say more, but Marcos, leader of the Calderas clan, called out harshly in Romani from the head of the caravan. At the sound of his voice, Sveta shrugged Kara's hand from her shoulder and continued on. "Now is not the time," she muttered. "We must be away before night falls." Frowning, Kara glanced back at the burning vardo. She waved farewell to the Cid guarding the flames that followed, climbing into the wagon Sveta indicated. Kara still felt the leader of the Rom scowling back at them from the side of his vardo. Inside Sveta's wagon, 3 young boys stared at Kara from the built-in bunks lining the walls. She jumped as the door closed sharply behind her, but the boys did not laugh or even giggle. They continued to watch her with dark, solemn eyes as the wagon lurched and began to move. Grimacing, Kara braced herself against the wall before moving to sit at the bench inside the wagon. She wondered if claiming a place with the Calderas clan had been wise, after all. The urge to howl gripped her. The need to turn back and fight shook her, but the fleeing one resisted. In their kind, the instinct for survival ran stronger than any other impulse. She broke the bond of her pack to preserve her kind through the young within her. As rarely happened in their long existence, one of the Bass fled lest their race meet its end. Slinking through the brush, she dropped her jaw and drew hard on the air. She tasted nothing of those who hunted her, nothing of choice prey, but something tinged the air temptingly close. Huffing slightly, she crept forward, parting the brush to peer out. A corporeal creature knelt in the clearing, arranging sticks in a peculiar manner, before kindling a flame and settling it into a sack upon the ground. The Bass narrowed her gaze and watched. This one was a pale shadow of their chosen prey. No power well, no essence, just a hint of energy not worth the effort to claim, and most certainly not sufficient for nesting the Bass's young. Still, the creature drew her. Tickled the memory of the black one and how he had hidden his spirit within another like a whelp returning to the nest. The Bass were mostly creatures of spirit, not earth. Could she hide in such a manner? Such a concept filled her mouth with a foul, bitter taste, but the need to survive gripped her harder and shoved. The Bass dropped low and slinked forward. Muscles rippled in subtle waves, and a low trill sounded deep in her throat, unbidden. The Bass stilled, and dropped her belly to the ground, but the knot prey did not bounce up or flee. She watched and drew herself forward. Again she sampled the air. This one had the faintest of flavors that spoke of shared blood with the Dion Maith, in their own tongue, the good people. To the Bass, they were the cursed ones, just as to the cursed ones the Bass were the Numhaid, or enemy. The knot prey likewise had no sense of self-preservation, unaware that death stalked nearby. The Bass crept closer yet, close enough to touch. She ran light fingers over soft, weak flesh and rough coverings. She leaned forward for a closer sampling of scent. A gentle tugging came as spirit clung to spirit. On impulse, the Bass hissed and drew back into a crouch, razor-sharp teeth bared and claws extended. The creature slumbered on, faintly snoring as if safe and secure in its own den. It took long moments for the Bass to calm. She moved about the clearing in a not-quite stalk, skin twitching beneath its pale velvety pelt and eyes searching for other threats. Slowly she settled, again squatting close to what had become now prey of sorts, for instinct now spoke to the bass most insistently. Again memories of the black one rose. Might the bass hide within as he had? Reaching out, she laid a hand to the other's flesh, and once more felt the tugging of their spirits as they twined. Following an impulse, she lay herself down upon the slumbering one, form aligned with form. The now prey twitched as if deep in a dream. A moan flowed out on labored breath, just tinged with fear. Limbs thrashed in jerking, uncoordinated motions. The bass's purr increased as the now prey sought to free herself from the melding. Too late, the hunter murmured as she gripped that captured soul tight and sank deeper into the other's body. She savored the bite of her host's panic as they became one. By the time they set camp late that night, Kara was too wiped out to do anything but sleep. When she woke the next morning in the wagon, Sveta and her sons were nowhere to be found. The same with Bakesgoth. Trying not to worry what mischief the sprite might be up to, Kara helped herself to some oatmeal left warming on the wood-burning stove before slinging Quicksilver's case across her back and venturing out into the cool, bright day. It felt like early spring or mid-fall. For all she knew, it could be either. She'd lost track of all time in the Sid realm. Drawing a deep breath, she basked in the warm sun and took joy in the bright blue sky, two things to never be taken for granted. She wandered a while among the wagons, some brightly painted and built from wood in the tradition of the Romani people, others battered metal caravans traveling under their own power, or pulled behind trucks or cars as you would find at any campground around the world. All of them bore the essence of the Rome, brightly painted, delightfully unique. Each family had their own camp, with carpets on the ground and cushions for sitting. Some had fire pits, others had portable grills. At some of the hearths, awnings had been raised for shelter from the elements. At others, battery-powered fairy lights had been strung from poles, but the space left open to the sky. As she explored, Kara relaxed into the day, enjoying the real-world magic of the Romani culture, free and untethered from any society but their own. Both the exotic and the mundane mingled as they adapted what they came by for their uses. Kara watched one group of women weaving a rug of intricate geometric patterns out of rags, while another bundled and hung herbs to dry. Some of the men were making horseshoes at a makeshift forge surrounded by smoke and ash and dry heat. If not for their dark scowls, she would have watched them longer, but instead quickly moved along. The sound of their hammers striking steel rang through the camp, blending with the women's chatter in an industrious song Kara longed to join. Throughout the morning, she remained polite and cheerful, despite the lukewarm reception she received. Everyone seemed wary, not hostile, but too reserved to be welcoming. Kara asked questions when something puzzled her, even offered to help when she saw them at their chores, but no one would speak to her in English, though she had no doubt the majority of them could, if they said anything at all. She gave up and continued exploring, wandering the camp that was for now her home, trying not to get in anyone's way. At one point, she felt eyes focus on her more so than the wary curiosity she'd met all morning. Her shoulders tensed with the weight of that gaze. Casually looking around, she noticed Marcos, the caravan leader, his arms crossed, an expression unreadable as he watched her. Though the sun picked out threads of silver woven through the waves of his dark brown hair, she could not tell if age or strain had added the faint webbing of lines across his forehead and around his bright blue eyes. She met his gaze with a faint smile and nodded respectfully. Marcos's brow dipped into a frown, clearly not happy she had noticed him. He dropped his arms and turned sharply away, heading across the camp to his wagon. Kara waited until he was out of sight, then resumed her wandering. The uncertainty she encountered from the adults apparently did not extend to the children. As Kara explored the camp, the sound of muffled giggles and scampering feet followed her until she amassed a fair parade of young followers. A smile lifted her lips, and she began to skip and dance with joy at the curiosity of youth, which broke down the walls of reserve. She didn't look too closely, but she noticed a few adult eyes crinkle at the goings-on, even if their lips refused to smile. The giggles grew louder. Her timid shadows pranced forward to join her as she continued to dance. As they neared the center clearing of the camp, she slowed and tried, though not too hard, to mimic their fluid moves as they twirled and leapt in clearly executed steps unique to the ROM. The children collapsed, their giggles blossoming into laughter at her comic efforts. Breathing hard more for effect than from the effort, Kara flopped to one of the rough logs set around the center clearing, where an unlit bonfire sat waiting for the evening. Remembering the night she'd played for these same ROM after the Battle of the Knock, Kara drew quicksilver from her case and began to tune the violin. That quick, the laughing and horsing round died down. The children turned bright eyes upon her, as did no few of the adults. Drawing a deep, calm breath, Kara allowed a subtle smile to grace her lips, while inside she sang Hallelujah. Music truly was the universal language. Not that she expected to be automatically accepted now, but this gave her hope. Kara allowed herself to savor this moment of happiness and peace. As the children settled in a circle around her, she began to play, not bothering with anyone else's composition, but allowing Quicksilver's own voice to rise in an unchoreographed song. As the notes filled the camp, Kara felt Danu's essence stir from where it resided in the violin and wrap around her in approval. Bolstered by the goddess, Kara continued to play through what was left of the morning until her fingers stung and her bow arm burned. The children came and went as they were presumably called to chores, but as the noon hour drew near, they wandered back, followed by their parents. With delight, Kara noted that some carried instruments, fiddles and guitars and pan flutes and spoons, but also a darbuka, a ukulele, cymbalum, bodhran, and half a dozen other instruments she wouldn't have known the names of if she hadn't studied at Juilliard. Others carried food or drink or nothing but themselves. However, they came, and it brought a broad grin to Kara's face. Not unsurprisingly, Big Scoth came with them, the shameless sprite, winding about the ankles of those carrying food, his thatch of unruly curls, a mix of every shade of red, brown, and gold, bobbing enthusiastically to the music. Most shocking was the fact that he wore his own form, human in feature and proportion, but about the size of a 12-inch action figure, rather than the cat seeming he usually favored. Not until that moment had she realized she'd not seen one feline in the camp. She filed that thought away for later consideration and turned her gaze back on her little friend. Kara laughed as he scampered just out of reach of the squealing children before circling back toward the food bearers. After all, this group of Rom were friendly to the Cid, and surely were familiar with failings such as Big Scoth. Kara smiled as she continued to play. You they can keep their distance from easily, a woman spoke softly beside her. The music, not at all. Smart that you should play. It reminds them you have done so before at our fire as an invited guest, and that they did not mind you so much then. Kara jumped a little at the unexpected comment, but quickly relaxed. It was comforting to hear words in English after a day of nothing but what she expected were Romani curses. She turned to find Sveta at her side. The woman sat down beside her and held out a mug of some herbal tea. Kara's belly rumbled at the spicy scent mingled with the rich aroma coming from the foods being passed around. Thank you. Kara set Quicksilver down beside her as other musicians began to play and accepted Sveta's peace offering, for such it was. After the impromptu lunch and concert, the members of the caravan rose and returned to their tasks. Some nodded at Kara as they passed, while the children waved or threw their arms around her in quick, impulsive hugs. Beside her, Sveta laughed softly. Very smart indeed. The woman rose and waved for Kara to join her. Come, Marcos would like to talk to you. Kara tensed for just a moment as she remembered the clan leader's sharp tone and annoyance as he grudgingly granted her request to join the caravan. She also remembered his impatience before they departed and the unreadable expression in his gaze as he watched her wander the camp earlier in the day. She expected that fear for his people formed the root of his displeasure. She could not blame him. With a deep, slow breath, she willed the tension to run out of her. She gathered up her things, brushed the dirt and bits of tree bark off her butt, and followed Sveta toward the wagon Marcos had entered earlier. The sounds of the bustling camp, punctuated by the laughter of both children and adults, comforted her. The calm, easy way Sveta chatted with her, telling her little details about the clan and its people as they passed, comforted her. The approaching conversation, that made her uneasy. Whatever the conversation she was to have with Marcos consisted of, Kara would keep her promise to Grand Dame Rose. As they entered the cool dimness of the wagon, Kara fought not to laugh as Beeg-Scoth, still in his true form, scampered up her back to hide beneath her hair. Clearly something of her amusement showed on her face, however, given Marcos's deepening glower. He did not offer her a seat on the bench across from him. Only when the door quietly clicked closed behind her did Kara realize Sveta had left the wagon. After a long moment of silence, Marcos spoke. I am honor-bound to give you a place among us. Do not believe for a moment I am happy about that. Through your actions, one of our own is dead, and another broken. Kara's heart clenched at the reminder, and she reached up to finger the copper pendant Rose had given her as a protection against evil. It had become a touchstone for her. She did not dispute his claim, though Tony's situation was no fault of her own. Her time among the Cid had not exactly been peaceful or without strife. Quite the opposite, in fact, or she wouldn't be here. She nodded, but remained silent. You are not a guest here, but you are not clan. We have given you the place that was offered. In exchange, you will help where you are asked, and you will respect our ways. You will not intrude where you are not invited. His bright blue gaze speared her until she nodded, then he went on. If you bring trouble to my people, we will consider honor met, and you will leave. She could not blame his bluntness. She knew exactly where it came from. Beeg-Scoth, on the other hand, seemed to take offense, coiling beneath the fall of her hair until she worried what he might do. Placing a restraining hand over him, she nodded again. Understood. Family before all others. Marcos looked stunned that she would know the mantra by which the Romani lived, and beneath that she may have seen a glimmer of respect hidden in his gaze. Rather than respond, though, he went back to whatever he was working on before she'd entered. Clearly dismissed, Kara lowered her hand and turned to the door. Before she knew it, Beeg-Scoth had pushed his way through the back of her hair and blew a prodigious raspberry all over Marcus. Kara looked back, ready to apologize. Instead, she choked on a laugh at the expression on Marcos's face, a spectacular blend of amusement and outrage. Fortunately, amusement won out, as the clan leader unleashed an equally prodigious belly laugh. Kara smiled and took her leave.